So for today, we're going to be introducing the skeletal muscles and identifying their actions. And then next week, we'll be pairing these up as antagonists, so muscle pairs that have opposing muscle actions, and also adding in the knee. Most of the anatomy and physiology labs will have histology with them, especially when you get to 1248. You'll have several slides, usually for each lab. And so we're going to bring back histology. And remember, there were the four main tissue types: epithelial, connective, muscle, and nerve. So when we get to the nervous system, we'll bring back some nervous system histology as well. There are three types of muscle tissues. We have smooth muscle, which has these very small fibers, and they are kind of spindle shaped, and they are controlled by the involuntary nervous system. They are what is called non-striated, and I'll talk about what causes striations in just a second. They always have a single nucleus, and this is partly because they are so small. And they're found in the visceral organs, such as stomach, small intestine, bladder, all along the GI tract. Pretty much everything that's controlled, the GI system that's controlled by the involuntary nervous system. Okay. We also have cardiac muscle tissue. It's found in the heart. These have a beautiful branched fiber shape. This allows it to, if you ever thought about your heart, it's kind of an unusual shape. It's not cylindrical like a GI, like your small intestine doesn't form that, circular structure. Instead, it forms this, this structure that's tapered, and then it forms chambers. And by having these branching fibers, it allows for that type of a structure. Okay, so that's pretty unique. These are called intercalated discs. They're a specialized type of gap junction that allows for rapid communication between these cells and is going to allow for those chambers to contract as a unit. Cardiac cells can have for simplicity's sake, we are going to say that they have one nucleus, that they are uninucleated. In reality, they can also be binucleated. Okay, so sometimes during creating these branch fibers, you'll fuse some cells and get some binucleated cells. But for simplicity's sake, so that we can have two distinct categories of uninucleated versus multinucleated, we're just going to say that cardiac tissue is uninucleated. And then we get to skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is controlled by the voluntary nervous system, which we will talk about in depth in lecture in a few more weeks. They are attached to, they're part of voluntary muscles, which attach to the bony skeleton, which we've spent the last few weeks learning in lab. These are extremely long fibers. So the sartorius is the longest muscle in your body, and these fibers are going to run the entire length of that muscle. So these are extremely long fibers. And in order to become so long, they fuse hundreds to thousands of them during development, and they'll become multinucleated. Okay, so through that development where they fuse, we get this multinucleated cell. So here, this long structure that kind of looks like a straw is a single skeletal muscle fiber. And this is number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. So there are maybe one, the top 8. So there's like 8 skeletal muscle fibers all running along parallel to each other. And inside becomes so packed full of muscle protein, actin, and myosin, being the dominant ones, that the nuclei get squashed and pushed right underneath that plasma membrane. So these dark oblong structures here are nuclei, and this is showing how this is multinucleated. Okay. Now the term striated means striped. So skeletal muscle is considered heavily striated, meaning that these stripes are very defined. Cardiac muscle tissue is also striated, but it's considered lightly striated because of the arrangement of muscle proteins is different than in skeletal muscle. In skeletal muscle, the actin and myosin's a much heavier protein, so it stains this dark red, and actin is a lighter protein, and so it doesn't stain as dark, and it leaves this the white band. So it's this, and they're tethered at something called a Z line into sarcomeres. But it's this arrangement, and it's a very highly structured arrangement that is going to create this striped appearance. So skeletal muscle is heavily striated with these alternating red and white stripes. Okay. There's also sometimes there are black and white slides for skeletal muscle. It just depends. So don't go by color. Go by identifying features. That smooth, it looks almost like a watercolor because they are not striated, and these are going to be small tapered cells that kind of fit in nicely together. Cardiac cells are going to have this branched shape with intercalated discs, and their nuclei stay very round. Okay, so that's a telltale feature of cardiac tissue, is that they're going to have a round nucleus. And then we get to skeletal muscle fibers, which are very long, and in order to become that long, they become multinucleated, and those nuclei get squashed up underneath the plasma membrane and flatten out, causing these disc-like structures. And then it's also heavily striated. Okay, I can probably, I would think that you will most likely have a question on one of these 3 slides, either in the quiz or in the lab exam. Okay, we usually do cover histology in those assessments. Okay. So then we have facial muscles. Most of these are controlled by the facial nerve, and they are going to be responsible for your facial expressions. For the facial muscles, you need to be able to identify them and then also to match them to their function. So the first one is frontalis, sometimes called epicranius, sometimes called occipitofrontalis. So it has a few different names, but frontalis is the part that is on the forehead. If it's called occipitofrontalis, it's because there's also a part on the occipital that attaches to the occipital bone. But from this viewpoint, we'll talk about frontalis. And when muscles contract, they're going to shorten. We're going to talk about their shortening action, bringing the insertion closer to the origin, and that'll cause this wrinkling of the forehead. We have corrugator supercilii. It looks like muscular eyebrows, and it will draw the eyebrows in towards the midline. We have buccinator, which I have better pictures of, but buccinator is a very large muscle, and it's deep, and it looks like a fan. It looks kind of like this. Looks kind of like a fan leaf. So buccinator, sometimes I joke that it's the selfie muscle. You know, when people started, they look like fish, like little goldfish, that they're using their buccinator muscle to compress their cheeks. So buccinator is your selfie muscle. It's going to compress the cheek. It would also blow air out of the mouth. And then we have two orbicularis muscles. So the term orbicularis comes from the same root of orbit. If you think of planets that orbit the sun, we have orbicularis oculi that orbits the eye socket, and when it contracts, it will close the eyelid. We also have another orbicularis muscle called orbicularis oris, which is going to surround. So oris, it comes from oral, meaning mouth, like the Oral-B toothbrushes. So when these muscles, when this muscle contracts, it's going to close the lips and kind of poof them out a little bit, protrude them. We also, to go along with taking great selfies, so there's buccinator over here, it's very deep. And then we have two zygomaticus muscles. We have minors on top, and then we have major over here. So the zygomaticus muscles are going to be responsible for what they consider what's called genuine smiling. So when someone has a genuine smile, they're actually genuinely happy, then zygomaticus muscles will pull the mouth corners up. If someone's faking a smile, they'll actually use a different muscle and it ends up pulling the corners back. So it's kind of interesting that we use different muscles to have genuine smiles versus, I guess, not genuine smiles. Okay. Then we have levator labii superioris, which is here, and it's on our torso model. It's going to be shown on the deep side. So I'll be reviewing that one a little bit more in depth. There's another one, levator labii, and it has like a nasal superioris, and that's this one. But when we're talking about levator labii superioris, the one on our torso model, it drops down on the deep side directly below the eyeball. Okay, so then we're going to move on to the muscles of the chin. And one that we don't show we don't have you identify, but it's kind of good to know, is there is a set of muscles directly on your chin called mentalis. And the reason why it's good to know that they're there is because if you work your way out, if you start at mentalis, then there's this set of muscles here, depressor labii inferioris. Depressor means to pull down. Labii means lips. So we're going to depress the lips. And then if you go, so you've got chin for mentalis, lips for depressor labii inferioris. And then if you go out to the next set, here and here, we have depressor anguli oris, lowering the angles, the corners. Oris is of the mouth. So we have depressor anguli oris, which is going to lower the corners of the mouth. So we have mentalis at the chin, so I kind of do this, and then the next one is out, is depressor labii inferioris. It's going to lower the lips. And then if you continue to go out, you have depressor anguli oris, which pulls the corners of the mouth down. Okay. So for the facial muscles, you need to be able to identify them. And the quizzes come from more like anatomical models. And then the lab exam is going to come from There's a skeletal muscle photo atlas that I'll be showing you. It's in your eLearn, and it's pictures of the torso. That is where your, as well as that lab exam review. Those are where the photos come from for your lab exam. Okay. We do have 3 muscles that are involved with chewing. So your mandible is this single very heavy bone. Okay. So it doesn't take a lot of effort because it's very heavy. We have the aid of gravity on our side. So it doesn't take much to lower that mandible. So if we had mentalis up here, you would just go underneath the torso model to this inferior aspect of the chin. And there are 2 small digastric muscles to help hold that mandible down. When we're trying to raise the mandible or chewing, gravity is not on our side. So we have to raise this very heavy bone repetitively. And so we're going to start, we need much larger muscles. We need some heavy duty muscles. So masseter is one of the strongest muscles in the body. And so masseter will originate here, and then it inserts actually underneath that mandible. And so when it contracts, it's going to elevate and pull the mandible up. There's also a large salivary gland on top of it, the parotid salivary gland, that provides salivary juices, digestive enzymes and things. Okay. Above, remember this is the external acoustic meatus, and then we've got that zygomatic process, and if you keep going up, now we have temporalis, and temporalis is going to attach to the temporal bone, and it will also insert down here on the mandible and elevate it during chewing. So 3 muscles to know for chewing. So now we are going to talk about the muscles at each joint. So we have the neck as a joint, we have the trunk as a joint, and in a minute after I go through some of these, we'll go over what the video of the muscle actions. So sternocleidomastoid, so for these muscles, you need to be able to identify them by name and also by their action. So if you were given a picture of like this and said, identify the muscle in red, you would need to be able to identify this muscle as sternocleidomastoid. And we'll go over it in the torso and another anatomy video. It's a very popular muscle with anatomists because it's named properly. It's named by its attachment points, which are to the sternum. Cleido means to the clavicle, and then mastoid is the mastoid process of that temporalis bone. So it's a common muscle to see again on quizzes and lab exams, and just in general for examples of muscles. When it contracts, its muscle action is to flex the head. And flexing the head brings the chin down towards the sternum. Okay, so flexing the head at the neck brings the head down towards the sternum. Okay, so that's flexion. Well, if we have our chin down, we now need to bring our head up. That is called extension. So if we want to go the other direction, that is extension. And the two muscles that will accomplish that are trapezius and splenius capitis. Trapezius is a large superficial muscle, and it has three sections. It has an upper section, has a middle section, and it has a lower section. But all three of these combined makes up the trapezius muscle. This upper section, you can see where it attaches here. When it contracts, it extends that neck. It's going to pull that head back. If you were to remove trapezius, just cut this section away, then you would see splenius capitis. So splenius capitis is deep to trapezius. And on the torso model, I'll show you that one side of the torso is superficial and one side of the torso is deep. And that is something to keep in mind when you're identifying muscles, is if you're looking for a large superficial muscle or if you're looking for something deeper like splenius capitis. So splenius capitis on our torso muscle, you can see that trapezius gets cut off here, and that splenius capitis is deep underneath it. And when splenius capitis contracts, it's also going to extend the head and pull that chin back up. Deltoid is a multi-purpose muscle. It is going to have an anterior portion, a medial, and then a posterior portion to it as well. So even though it's one muscle, it has three actions at the shoulder joint. This anterior is going to flex the arm. So when you flex at the shoulder joint, you bring the arm forward. And then the posterior is going to extend it, which means to bring that arm back. And then we have that it also is an abductor, and it's what's called a true abductor. It's along the line of motion. So it can abduct, and that AB becomes very important. But abduct means to take away. So take away from the midline. So to abduct, you move your arm away from the midline. We'll talk about its antagonist in just a minute, and then we'll bring up antagonists as pairs next week. But I like to just bring them up a little bit now because they're here when we're learning about flexion from sternocleidomastoid and extension from trapezius and splenius capitis. If we get, now we're getting to the muscles of the chest, and we'll start at the front, and we'll start very superficial. So this large muscle at the front, on the anterior, on the superficial side, is pectoralis major. And when you can kind of see how it inserts in the underarm here. When it contracts, it is going to flex the arm. It's going to move it forward. That's its primary movement. Some of these muscles will have secondary movements, and if they're not in your lab manual, they're probably not on the slide, but you may see them, you may see a secondary movement, like if you were to Google it, and that's fine. Pectoralis minor and serratus anterior are deeper muscles. So they're going to be on the deep side of the torso model. They are both called pennate muscles. They look like feathers. So it's important to identify pectoralis minor first, because pectoralis minor has three distinctive heads. So it originates, it has a section here, and then it has three heads here. So if you count 1, 2, 3, then this is pectoralis minor. And when it contracts, you can see how it had, so this is its origin, this is actually its insertion. When it contracts, it's going to bring the scapula forward. It has an attachment point on the scapula, and it pulls it forward. So the first three are pec minor. These are serratus anterior. So for my little quiz, you could tell this is pec minor. This is serratus anterior. What number is sternocleidomastoid?
1.
1, thank you. What number is pec major?
3.
And then deltoid is number?
2.
Thank you. Okay. These are all muscles you may see again. Okay. We have then the diaphragm. And the diaphragm is this dome-shaped muscle. And so when you want to breathe, you contract the diaphragm and it flattens. It flattens down, and that causes negative pressure drawing air into your lungs. So under normal conditions of inhalation and exhalation, inhalation is an active process, and then exhalation is a passive process. The diaphragm just relaxes. We do have these external and internal intercostals that cause a forced increase or a forced decrease in thoracic volume. So external intercostals are further, they're on the exterior. So when they contract, they pull those ribs out. So they would allow you to inhale extra amounts of air. So if you're exercising, you're going to activate those because you need to bring in more air into that thoracic cavity. The internal intercostals, and I'll show you on the pictures of the between the rib bones. So I'll show you that in detail when we get to those pictures. But the internal intercostals, when they contract, will forcibly decrease that thoracic volume, and that causes a forced exhalation. So if you're trying to blow extra air out. We have, now if we're going to be, so we're going to start by talking about extending the trunk. So flexing the trunk is when you touch your toes. And extending the trunk is coming back up. And we have two muscles that are going to be used. Well, there's actually a lot more than that. There's two muscles that we're going to go over that allow for trunk extension. And together they're known as a group called erector spinae. They're actually longissimus and spinalis, but together, and in your lab exam, and I don't think they're on your lab quiz, but they are called the erector spinae group. They're not divided into those two muscles. They are shown deep, and they're deep to latissimus dorsi, and I think they're actually on the other side of our torso model, and they're kind of just visible in this mid-back area. But so the erector spinae group extends the trunk. So we're going to kind of now move on to, so latissimus dorsi is still going to be moving the arm at the shoulder, and then we're going to be talking about the upper arm muscles. So latissimus dorsi, this is the muscle that gets very enlarged in swimmers. So if you see like I really miss the Olympics. But if you see Olympic caliber, especially like butterfly swimmers, they have hugely developed latissimus dorsi muscles because there is no better activity than butterfly swimming for extending and adducting the arm. So extending is pulling that arm back, and then you would use the deltoid to abduct it. But then if you need to pull the arm back down, that is latissimus dorsi. So butterfly swimming alternates latissimus dorsi, deltoid, and then lat again. So it just is kind of using these muscles a lot. Stroke I was never able to master. I'm sure some of you did. Okay, so it inserts underneath the arm. It can pull the arm back in extension, and it is our main adductor of the arm and pulling the arm back down. Okay, so we're going to move on to biceps and triceps. So our arms are going to be different from our legs in that for our arms, both the joints are on the anterior part of the body. Okay, so when we talk about flexing the arm and flexing the forearm, they can both be accomplished by the same muscle. And biceps brachii main purpose is to flex the forearm, but it can also pull on the arm as well. But it's just to keep in mind that both the shoulder and the elbow joint, these are on the same plane of movement. They both, when they flex, they'll flex in the same plane. This becomes different when we talk about our lower leg. So on the anterior aspect of the body, we have the very large biceps brachii muscle. It is the primary forearm flexor, but it can also flex at the shoulder. This is looking at the posterior view, so looking back, you can see latissimus dorsi. The triceps muscle is the main forearm extensor, so it's going to extend at that elbow joint, and then it can also extend the arm at the shoulder. So those are kind of unique in that they, because of the way the joints are aligned, they flex both the arm and the forearm. Triceps brachii both extends the arm and the forearm. Moving on to the abdominals. We have 4 abdominal muscles that you need to be able to identify. The most superficial and medial is rectus abdominis, king of the abdomen. When we flex the trunk, we're going to be pulling the trunk down, like touching our toes. The other way of accomplishing this is to pull the femur up towards your body. So we'll be talking, and that's called flexion at the hip. So, but right now we're just going to be talking about our intention is to flex the trunk, so to touch our toes. We also have the external obliques, and the external obliques, you can identify them by their location on the model, when ours are going to be on the superficial side of our torso model, but they run like a V. Okay, so they run this way, and on the other side this way. Okay, internal obliques are going to be deep, so they're going to be on the deeper side of our torso model, and they run up. Okay, they go this way. So we have rectus abdominis, that 6-pack, which I guess some people could actually get an 8-pack if you really made everything super defined, is in the middle. Our external obliques are going to run in a V-shaped, and our internal obliques run like a mountaintop. And then transverse abdominis is only shown on the flip side, on the back side of our torso model. We'd have to take this chest plate off and turn it completely over. And they run this way. So we have all sorts of arrangements, right? Rectus abdominis, external oblique, internal oblique, and transverse abdominis. But it is of note that this one is going to be on the back side of that chest plate only. Another way to flex the trunk is to use, and also you can flex it at the hip joint as well. Like so you can bring the femur up towards your body, or you can lower your trunk down towards your toes. They accomplish the same purpose of collapsing that joint angle. These are core muscles. They are called the iliopsoas muscle group, and it is made up of psoas major and then iliacus. It's important to know the two muscles that make up this group. So know, and I think I'm missing an O here, iliopsoas group, and then is made up of psoas major and iliacus. So make sure you can identify them separately and then as a group. Gluteus maximus is our large muscle on the posterior side of our body. And when it contracts, it's going to pull the leg back at the hip. It's going to extend the thigh at the hip. Gluteus medius is on the side, on the lateral aspect of that iliac crest. And when it contracts, it is a true thigh abductor. Okay, so it takes the thigh away from the midline. If we want to bring the thigh back to midline, we have gracilis, which runs, so gracilis is a true adductor. It runs along the axis of movement. So it runs straight along the middle of the thigh. There's no rotation involved. When gracilis contracts, it is going to adduct that thigh. And then we also have a group of adductors that you only need to be able to identify as a group. And that's primarily because the main one that you see in the torso model and in the leg model is going to be adductor magnus. But gracilis runs straight, okay, straight down. And then on either side, you're going to be able to see the adductors, and mainly adductor magnus. But when you're looking at a leg model, gracilis runs straight. And then on either side, kind of looking like muscles, are the adductors. Do not confuse. This is sartorius. Sartorius is the longest muscle in the body, and it is going to be able to rotate and flex. You can see because it runs crossways across from the hip down to the medial aspect of the knee. For some reason, students like to confuse sartorius and gracilis, I think because they're both these kind of relatively long muscles. But sartorius is more on the front of the leg, and it's very long, and then it curves around because you have to go here and then you have to curve around the knee. So it's long and it ends up curving around the knee. Gracilis is a medium length muscle, and it is just perfectly straight from inner thigh down to inner knee, and then it's surrounded by adductors. So don't get those confused. So here we have sartorius. It is going to start laterally and it ends medially. It is can flex the thigh, but is also a rotator. So when we talk about sartorius and muscle action, we usually just have sartorius as kind of identification muscle because it's a little bit more complicated on its method of action. You definitely, because we're going to be covering the knee next week, so you might as well learn it now. You like star or highlight or make great notes, but this slide and the next one, you need to have next to you. They need to have it in your your thoughts when you're taking quizzes and lab exams, because this concept, as well as the hamstrings concept, is a huge part of this week's lab and next week's lab. So I can absolutely guarantee that you are going to need to know that the quadriceps group flexes the thigh and extends the knee. Okay, so these are different actions. When rectus femoris contracts, it can bring the femur forward, which is flexing the thigh at the hip. Its main action, though, is to extend the knee. So these actions are opposite because this is decreasing, this angle is decreasing. So it's flexion. But this angle is increasing. So it is extending. So the quadriceps flex at the thigh, but extend at the knee. And that's a very important concept, as well as knowing what four muscles are part of the quadriceps group and identifying them. Rectus femoris is the one on top, and it is this large superficial muscle, and it's going to, this is the quadriceps tendon, which then attaches to the patella and then will become the patellar tendon as it continues down. So it's this large superficial muscle. If we take rectus femoris out of the way, then we can see all three vastus muscles. Unless you cut rectus femoris out, you can't see vastus intermedius because it's deep to it. But if we were to remove rectus femoris, we would have vastus medialis, vastus intermedius underneath, and then vastus lateralis. So do make sure that you're getting your medial side and your lateral side correct. Antagonizing or opposing the quadriceps are the hamstrings. And there's three of these. And so the three hamstrings are going to extend the thigh. So they're going to pull back on that at that joint and extend, pulling the leg back. But then, so that's an extension here. But then when they contract, you can see that they have a large action here at the knee for flexing. So the hamstrings are going to be, we extend at the hip and we flex at the knee. And there are three of them. Biceps femoris runs by itself. It is going to connect to the lateral aspect of that knee. And then semitendinosus and semimembranosus, these two always run together because they insert on the medial aspect of the knee. And if you Google this, you'll see a couple of different arrangements. But on our model and on most graphics, you'll see that semitendinosus is going to be the one is going to be the superficial muscle, and then semimembranosus is going to peek out on either side. So I'll show you this on the torso model, but like, see, even this is a slightly different representation. So it's best to learn it from those torso model pictures. And so we will review that on those torso model pictures. Moving on down, we have the very large gastrocnemius muscle. It can also flex. Should be the knee. Okay, so it causes flexion at that knee joint. And then it's a major muscle of plantar flexion. So plantar flexion is pointing the toes. If you were to remove the gastrocnemius muscle, you'll have soleus underneath. Soleus is involved in plantar flexion. It's also, okay, tibialis anterior is next to the tibia. When it is contracting, it is going to dorsiflect or pull those toes back up. Ligaments and tendons that you need to know are the patellar tendon. We'll go over that next week. And then the calcaneal tendon, also known as the Achilles tendon, extends from that gastrocnemius muscle, and it will attach at the calcaneus, that very large heel bone at the very bottom of your tarsals. Okay. So I have two videos that we're going to transition to before we go over the lab exam review. And for the lab exam review, we're only going to go over the new torso model because that's where your lab exam is coming from, and I actually kind of don't want to confuse you by going over multiple models. Okay, so flexion decreases the joint angle, extension increases the joint angle. So muscles that flex are going to antagonize muscles that extend, and in the reverse, we have elevation and depression that we use with the mandible. Abduction, AB, abduct means to move away from the midline. Okay, so we're moving away. And then adduct, to move back down, is to move towards the midline. Plantar flexion and dorsiflexion are going to, there are 4 movements that actually refer to feet only: plantar flexion, dorsiflexion, inversion, and eversion. But plantar flexion is pointing your toes, that's going to be gastrocnemius and soleus. And then dorsiflexion is tibialis anterior, pulling those toes back. Okay, so the pages probably don't match up to anything. I believe they're, yeah, they're from the last lab manual, so ignore these pages numbers. But you should go over. So on the new lab manual, it's 33, 34. 35 and 36, and 37. And so there's no actual like activities to write in this week, but you should be able to go over that list of muscles and identify them on what I'm going to show you next. This one. So this is in your eLearn shell. So it's located, because we use it for lab 6 and 7, it's located in a tab between lab 6 and lab 7, and it says photos of skeletal muscle. These are, so this is a reference for you to use. These are the photos that will be used for your lab exam, and they do a really nice job of showing you where all these muscles are. So if you need a reference for our torso model, this is it. Okay. So this is a great, this is the reference that you should be using. So this is where levator labii superioris is. So this reference is what you need to use to study for the lab exam. One thing also though is that these labels will not show up in the eLearn viewer. If you want the labels to show up, then you need to download the PowerPoint file. Okay. Let's see if I can get to one. Okay, so on our torso model, we have a superficial side and a deep side. So the superficial side is going to show superficial muscles such as trapezius and latissimus dorsi. On the deep side, we've cut those muscles away so that you can see what's below them. So on the deep side of your model, we cut away trapezius to expose splenius capitis here. And then trapezius has also been cut away to expose erector spinae, spinalis and longissimus here as the erector spinae group. I think it's shown elsewhere. This model is also showing how the external intercostals are going to be shown as between the rib bones, and the internal intercostals are in between the blue cartilage on the model. And if you were in lab and you ran your finger along, it would then kind of fall into this little depression here. You could tell that this is external and this is internal. There's a little bit of a ledge. But the torso model is designed such as the external intercostals are between the rib bones and internal is between the costal cartilage. So this gives you a little bit better view of how that little divot depression works, that transition. Okay, so these are all internal here, and this is all external here. This is showing pectoralis minor and then serratus anterior over here. So here you can see erector spinae. So these are just really good with identifying all of them. On our model, again, this is on the front side. This is showing how this side is superficial. So we have pectoralis major here, and we have our external obliques over on the superficial side. On the deep side, we've cut away. This is a connective tissue band, and then we've cut away the external obliques, and so now we're leaving pectoralis minor. You can see rectus, abdominis, and then the internal obliques climb like a mountain here, and then transverse abdominis on that inside of that plate. Okay. Diaphragm. This is psoas major. This is iliacus. This is the iliac crest here. So iliacus is the surface here. Psoas major is here. Okay. So we're going to go over a lot of these on the lab exam review as well. This shows how soleus is deep to gastrocnemius. And then there is a section that has unlabeled, and so you can quiz yourself and just go through that first page and second page, the list of muscles, and see if you can identify what those muscles are. And just like we saw on the trunk, we have a deep side and then a superficial side. So on the deep side, you get things like corrugator supercilii, and you get temporalis here, and you get buccinator. And then this is levator labii here. On the superficial side, you're going to get your zygomaticus muscles, and this is masseter underneath. This is the parotid gland. We don't have one that's full on face, just straightforward. And then you're going to have orbicularis oris and orbicularis oculi. Okay, so that just introduces you to where those are. Okay, so that's a great reference, and it is located over here. Okay, so now we have, I just have 2 videos, and then we'll go over the first part of that lab exam review. So in anatomical position, we're supinated. Our palms are supinated in anatomical position. And then I have, in this one, I just go over the muscles with an atlas. Speed it up a little bit. So today we need to go over and identify some of the facial muscles. So this is the frontalis muscle, and it will wrinkle the forehead. Is that volume okay? This is corrugated supercilii. It will move the eyebrows to the midline. These are the orbicularis oculi muscles, and when they contract, they will close the eyelids. These are the zygomaticus muscles, and when they contract, they will elevate the corners of the mouth. This is levator labii superioris. When it contracts, it will elevate the upper lip. This is orbicularis oris. When it contracts, it will close and protrude the lips. This is depressor anguli oris. When it contracts, it will lower the corners of the mouth. These are depressor labii inferioris, and when they contract, they will lower the lips. This is buccinator. When it contracts, it will compress the cheeks. We are now going to move on to the three muscles of chewing. So it takes two strong muscles to elevate the mandible, but only small muscles to lower it. The large muscles that elevate the mandible are temporalis. So temporalis will elevate the mandible. Masseter is another large muscle that will elevate the mandible, and it wraps around the mandible. You can see how it wraps around. So this is masseter. And then the small muscle that is responsible for lowering the mandible is digastric. So it's these very small muscles on the inferior aspect of the mandible. Now we're going to look at sternocleidomastoid, which is this muscle which flexes the neck. Sternocleidomastoid flexes the neck and brings the chin down towards the sternum. This is another look at sternocleidomastoid. The antagonist to sternocleidomastoid is splenius capitis.
splenius capitis extends the head. Trapezius is a large muscle that has 3 parts. The upper part, shown in orange, will also extend the head at the neck joint. But all 3 of these sections are included in the trapezius muscle: upper, middle, and lower. So all of these are set parts of the trapezius muscle. The deltoid muscle will flex the arm forward, extend the arm back, as well as abduct the arm away from the body. And it also has 3 parts. So this anterior part flexes the arm forward, this posterior part extends the arm back, and this medial part will abduct the arm away from the body. If we look at the muscles of the chest, pectoralis major can both adduct and flex the arm. If we look at pectoralis minor, it has 3 points of origin, and it inserts on the coracoid process of the scapula. So it will move the scapula in an anterior or forward motion. So the pectoralis minor will move the scapula forward. Serratus anterior will also move the scapula forward. Serratus anterior are these other feather-like muscles that sit directly underneath pectoralis minor. If we look at the external intercostals, they will elevate the ribs and increase thoracic volume. The internal intercostals will depress the ribs and decrease thoracic volume. The diaphragm is this dome-shaped muscle, and when you inhale, it will flatten, increasing thoracic volume. The latissimus dorsi is this very large flap of muscle, and when it contracts, it will both extend and adduct the arm. We also have a group of deep muscles called the erector spinae group that is responsible for extending the trunk. This group is made up of spinalis and longissimus. So this group together is called erector spinae. On the back of the arm, we have triceps brachii, which is responsible for extending the arm as well as extending the forearm. On the front of the arm, we have biceps brachii, which is responsible for flexing the arm at the shoulder, as well as flexing the forearm at the elbow. We have 4 abdominal muscles. We have rectus abdominis, which is responsible for flexing the trunk. We have the external obliques, which form this V shape. We have internal obliques that run up to make a point. And we have transverse abdominis, which is shown on the most interior aspect of the torso model that runs as completely parallel fibers, also responsible for flexing the trunk. For our core muscles, we have 2 muscles that make up the iliopsoas group. We have psoas major and iliacus. For our gluteus muscles, we have gluteus maximus, which will extend the leg backwards. And gluteus medius, which is an abductor. So gluteus medius will abduct at the hip joint and move the leg away from midline. For the muscles of the leg, we have gracilis, which will adduct the leg. And then we have a group of adductors. It's actually adductor longus and adductor brevis and adductor magnus. I'll go over them again on the torso model. There's also sartorius, and sartorius can flex and medially rotate the leg at the knee. So sartorius is the longest muscle in the body. Now we're going to move on to the quadriceps femoris group, which is made up of 4 muscles. And we'll start off with rectus femoris. So rectus femoris sits on top. And the quadriceps as a group will flex at the thigh and extend at the knee. We remove rectus femoris, we can see the 3 vastus muscles. Vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, and vastus lateralis. So for the quadriceps, we have vastus medialis, vastus intermedius, and vastus lateralis. And then on top is rectus femoris, and those 4 make up the quadriceps femoris group. Moving to the hamstrings group, which will extend the thigh at the hip and flex the knee. We have biceps femoris, which is going to run to the lateral aspect of the knee. And then we have semitendinosus and semimembranosus, which are going to run to the medial aspect of the knee. So the hamstrings is a group of 3 muscles that extend the thigh at the hip and then flex the knee, made up of biceps femoris running to the lateral side, semitendinosus, and semimembranosus running to the medial aspect of the knee. Gastrocnemius is this large muscle in the lower leg, and it can also flex at the knee, but its major action is in plantar flexion, so pointing those toes. If we remove gastrocnemius, we can see soleus, and soleus is also involved in plantar flexion at the ankle joint, so pointing those toes. So both soleus and gastrocnemius are involved in plantar flexion. We go back to the front side. We have tibialis anterior. Tibialis anterior is involved in dorsiflexion, pulling those toes up. It runs right alongside of the tibia. So tibialis anterior is involved in dorsiflexion.
Okay, so you do not have access to this tool. So I just made a video that had the muscles that we're looking at on it. The last thing that we're going to go through is the lab test review, and we're not going to go through it all because you only are responsible for knowing the newer torso model. So that's as far as we're going to go. So what type of muscle tissue is this? It is heavily striated. These are nuclei. So this makes it what type?
Skeletal.
Skeletal muscle, very good. Is it multinucleated? Yes. Is it voluntary?
Yeah.
Yep. And is it striated?
Yep.
Yep. Okay. So here we have beautiful branched cells. So this must be
Cardiac.
Yep. And does anyone remember what this is called? It's called an intercalated disc. And it will be a specialized gap junction to allow communication between the cardiac muscle cells. And then these are those nice round nuclei that you'll see. Okay, if we were to ask this question, is this tissue considered multinucleate? We'd expect you to answer no, because the majority are going to be uninucleate with a few binucleated cells. So, and if we asked you this, the answer would be no. Is cardiac muscle tissue voluntary?
No.
No, thank goodness. That's why, we can go to sleep and still wake up. Okay, so this brings us to our third type of muscle tissue, which is what?
Smooth.
Yep. So these are small tapered fibers. They are not multinucleated, they're uninucleated. Is it considered striated?
No.
No, it is the tissue type that is not striated. You'll learn more about smooth muscle in 1242. And this is going to be found in like the GI tract. Okay, so when you're looking at the lab exam review, just focus on the newer torso model. Your slides will not be on the old torso model. Do you guys remember how to stamp? If you go up to that annotate feature, and it will drop down, and then if you get to see the stamp feature, you'll see like arrows, stars, hearts, check marks. So if you could put a star on temporalis, so you guys can remember how to stamp. Yay, okay. Let's put a heart on corrugator supercilii. Be super silly with our eyebrows. Okay, then the next one we're going to do is, let's go ahead and identify sternocleidomastoid. Yep, that one's sternocleidomastoid down here. Then we are going to compress our cheeks with buccinator. Yep, so we have buccinator, and then we have orbicularis oris, which will close our lips. Very nice. We also have depressor labii. Okay, so depressor labii is going to do the lips. It's going to be this one, yep. And then the next one is depressor anguli oris, depresses the corners of the mouth. And then back here, this one's a little bit harder to kind of maybe visualize, but if we have sternocleidomastoid flexing the head, we also want to be extending the head. And this is a portion of the trapezius muscle. Now we're going to, let's go back and identify orbicularis oculi, which will close our eyelids. And then we have zygomaticus minor, and then zygomaticus major is the one that's identified to uplift the corners of our mouth as we smile. Yep. Then the next one below that is we have depressor anguli oris. It's going to pull down and oppose zygomaticus, so pull down those mouth corners. And then if we look at our neck joint, we have muscle that flexes the neck. We have sternocleidomastoid. I know, so this one is actually going to be identifying this muscle here. So sternocleidomastoid. And then we have two that are going to be opposing sternocleidomastoid. This is the superficial one known as trapezius. And then this is a different version of looking at splenius capitis, and we would not be presenting it from this view. We would present it from a full posterior view where you can see that the trapezius has been cut away. But just in case there's some of you wondering, what is that muscle that we're trying to be identifying? It's just an alternate view. So from this one though, the takeaway is that sternocleidomastoid is going to be flexing and trapezius is an extensor. We don't usually identify this one anymore. This is the occipital belly of frontalis, sometimes called occipitofrontalis. Okay, so this is here where I was talking about, where we were talking about muscles that extend. And it also, this moves the scalp, it doesn't move the neck. So what we want to be focusing on are these two muscles that are going to extend the head at the neck. We have the superficial one, that is trapezius, the upper portion of trapezius. That one's here. And then if you cut it away and you go to the deep side, you're going to have splenius capitis underneath. So splenius capitis is deep to trapezius. Okay, so go ahead and identify trapezius on this one, since we just did that. It's a superficial muscle that extends the head. And then it has an agonist, something that has the same movement, and that would be splenius capitis. So it sits just underneath it on the deep side. Yep. And then we have deltoid. Deltoid is going to be able to flex, extend, and abduct the arm. And if we move to our back, we have, this one is going to be showing, this is the lower section of trapezius. And then this muscle here is going to adduct the arm as well as extend it, and it is known as, anyone know? That big superficial muscle. This is latissimus dorsi. And if you remove trapezius, you'll see the erector spinae group on the deep side of the torso. Moving on to the front, why don't you go ahead and identify deltoid? We've already done that one on the shoulder. And remember where deltoid is? Yep. And then we have pectoralis major is going to be the large anterior muscle on the front of the chest that can extend that forearm. I'm sorry, flex the forearm, flex the arm. So pectoralis major will flex the arm. So it's large and superficial. It's going to be this one here. This is showing the beginning of biceps brachii, which will also flex the arm and the forearm. If you cut away pectoralis major, then you're going to be able to see the first of our scapular movers, which is pectoralis minor. So this is the 1, 2, 3 heads that are going to insert on the scapula and move it in a forward motion. We also get to see our abdominal muscles. So we have king of the abdomen is rectus abdominis. We have our external obliques forming a V, and then we have our internal obliques forming a mountaintop. If we go to the next one, we'll be able to see another view of pectoralis minor, where it is going to insert on the scapula and move it forward. And then underneath, we have a nice view of serratus anterior, these pennate muscles. In between, this is just how our model is set up. Of course, both of these layers continue over the entire surface. But our torso model is set up that the external intercostals are going to be in between these rib bones, and that the internal intercostals are in between the costal cartilage. So it's just giving another view of pectoralis minor, those 3 heads, and then serratus anterior, or the pennate muscles that are more lateral and slightly deeper. We have our external intercostals that are going to increase thoracic volume, and then this would be internal intercostals. This is the beginning of rectus abdominis. If we, so now we're going to move to our hip joint, and flexing would be touching your toes or bringing your femur closer to your trunk. So shortening this angle. we have the iliopsoas group made up of iliacus and psoas major. So iliacus is this surface here, and then we have psoas major is this muscle here. This is sartorius, and then we are just starting to see an adductor peek out, but we wouldn't use that this presentation for adductors, but this is the beginning of sartorius. This is giving you a view of transverse abdominis. So transverse abdominis is going to actually help to hold our abdominal contents, our abdominal wall in. And it runs transverse, and it's seen on the flip side of that chest plate. That's the only place on our torso model that you can see it. Another view of sterno, cleido, mastoid. And then this is showing you the digastric muscles up underneath the chin that are used in chewing. Another view of serratus anterior. And then the two superficial muscles on the back are trapezius and latissimus dorsi. This also gives a kind of a nice view of that erector spinae group. That's on that deep side of that torso as well. One more view of latissimus dorsi that's going to both adduct and extend the arm. This is gluteus maximus, which will extend the thigh at the hip, pull that back. And then gluteus medius. So gluteus medius is our hip abductor. It is going to pull the thigh away at the hip joint from the midline. So it's an abductor. Okay, so this is showing the three heads of deltoid and how it is able to both flex and extend and abduct the arm at the shoulder joint. We have the beginning of biceps brachii on the anterior side, which is also an arm flexor and forearm flexor. This is the beginning of triceps brachii, which is an arm extensor and a forearm extensor at the elbow, and then pectoralis major. Okay, so those are the slides that you need to know from the lab exam review. You won't be seeing the slides from the older torso model, but then remember that you do need to be familiar with these photos as well. And there's both a labeled section that is only, those labels come down when you download the PowerPoint. And then there's that unlabeled section as well that you can use to quiz yourself. Okay.